Folks, hello and welcome to Tavern Chat. I'm your host, Eric Tenkar, your bartender in the OSR. By the way, just so you know, there is a link on the bottom of the screen. Tenkars, there's tavern.games slash cipher. This is a link to Monty Cook's Humble Bundle, and it has the cipher system stuff. Doesn't really interest me. It does also have those Patolus and Baywarns and related early 3E stuff, which is very easily transferable, convertible to the OSR. Patolus is one of the best city settings ever produced for RPGs, let alone a D20 system. So I think it's just something you could look at. And if you do happen to purchase it, a few coins will go into the tavern's coffers. We don't do sponsorships. We don't do ad reads. So this is how we keep ourselves afloat. So looking at the 1E DMG, and listen, I don't think there's anything really quotable from the 2E DMG. But this is in the beginning of the DMG. And yeah, I've read this in the past, and I think it's been discussed online that AD&D was a bit of a reaction to the way original D&D and especially Basic Expert, or especially the Basic set at that point, was it was being played too loosely, right? It was not necessarily a strict interpretation of the rules. People were house ruling, and this was a reaction to it. So, returning again to the framework aspect of Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, what is aimed at is a universe into which similar campaigns and parallel worlds can be played. By the way, additionally, the advantage to AD&D over basic or white box was that you could go to a game convention and expect to have the same rules for everybody. It wasn't like, oh, all these little house rules, but the reality was we house ruled. Weapon speed, segments lasted a while for our casters, but weapon speed went out the door real quickly. We never even bothered with the weapons versus armor adjustments because it didn't make much sense because it didn't really apply to the monsters, only to the PCs. At least as written. Or, it was just, there was a lot of stuff that didn't quite work in AD&D's written. You threatened to do unarmed combat. As a GM, I threatened to kill your character. I did not want to break those charts out. You better be looking to kill your opponent because we are not grappling. Not happening. So, in any case, with certain uniformity of systems and laws, players will be able to move from one campaign to another. We, even back in the early 80s, we didn't allow you to bring your PC from somebody else's campaign. If it wasn't a campaign within the group, somebody new was coming into the group, you got a new character. Maybe we would start you off a level or two below the average PC level, but you weren't bringing a character from another campaign because you weren't going to be balanced for this campaign. We learned that real quickly. So, because people just kind of created their own, those stats when you were in junior high school just kind of crept up. It was amazing. You would solo play a deck of many things and discard the cards that were detrimental. Just saying. It was junior high school. So, with certain uniformity systems and laws, players will be able to move from one campaign world to another and know at least the elemental principles which govern the new milieu. For all milieu will have certain, but not necessarily the same, laws in common. Again, the conformity of the rules. The early D&D rules were being played differently on the West Coast. Character races and classes will be nearly the same. Now, notice he's not saying exactly the same because he is already recognizing that AD&D will be house ruled. Character ability scores will have the identical meaning, or nearly so. Now, my campaigns, we didn't use gender-related limits to female stats. But you played if you were playing a male or a female character, strength limit was whatever. We it didn't make a difference. We weren't using that. So, magic spells will function in a certain manner regardless of which world the player is functioning in. And a lot of times you made DM rulings on certain spells, and you could go to a different campaign or a convention, and it played certainly differently. Magic devices will certainly vary, but their principle will be similar. This uniformity will help not only players, it will enable DMs to carry on a meaningful dialogue and exchange of useful information. It might also eventually lead to grand tournaments wherein persons from any part of the US or the world for that matter can compete for accolades. Again, AD&D was being set to be the system that everybody runs it relatively the same. It wasn't to be house ruled greatly. We all did. We didn't call it house rule. The danger of a mutable system, again, D&D, is that you or your players will go too far in some undesirable direction and end up with a short-lived campaign. You know what? I believe that many of those West Coast campaigns were extremely long-lived, but they morphed into, often, other systems. Participants will always be pushing for a game which allows them to become strong and powerful far too quickly. Monty Hall was a problem even in AD&D. Each will attempt to take the game out of your hands and mold it to his or her own ends. By the way, just an observation, even here, Gary was essentially being gender neutral, right? His or her. So he was acknowledging that there were female players even back then. Just a historical note, folks. Just a historical note. To satisfy this natural desire is to issue a death warrant to a campaign. Yes, a campaign that goes way too powerful probably won't last the longest, but that's all neither here nor there. For it will either be a one-player affair or the players will desert en masse for something more challenging and equitable. Wow, that word was being used even back then. Similarly, you must avoid the tendency to drift into areas foreign to the game as a whole. What that would be. Such campaigns become so strange as to no longer be, I'm guessing is what should be there, AD&D. They are isolated and will usually wither. Variation and differences are desirable, but both should be kept within the boundaries of the overall system. Now, Gary, with the DMG, uses different systems for melee and missile combat compared to unarmed combat and overbearing compared to psychic combat, right? Psionics, which has its own weird ass subsystem. So there's a lot of reasons why, Gary was already seeing things like arms law and claw law, right? These tack on combat systems or tack on spells. He was seeing this game potentially morph into directions that he didn't want, because if it morphs somewhere else, it becomes somebody else's game and somebody else's monetary supply, income source, right? Imaginative and creative addition can most certainly be included. That is why nebulous areas have been built into the game, which he mentioned which those areas are there, but okay. Keep such individuality in perspective by developing a unique and detailed world. Now, this is where he says this: if you really want to tinker with the world. Don't tinker with the rules. Tinker with the world. A unique and detailed world based on the rules of Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. No two campaigns will ever per, ever be the same, but all will have the common grounds necessary to maintaining the whole as a viable entity, about which you and your players can communicate with the many thousands of others who also find swords and sorcery role playing gaming as as an amusing and enjoyable pastime. So, again, uh, Gary doesn't want you house ruling, right? And it's understandable. If you want to have a system that is usable for tournament play, it has to be consistent. Has to be the same game played at was it like Winter Fantasy Con as it is at Gen Con, as it is at Gen Con East Coast, Gen Con West Coast, Gen Con Europe, wherever these tournaments are that are being, especially ones that maybe are being sponsored by TSR at the time, you need a consistent system. But the reality is, AD&D wasn't it. Like, what first edition was house ruled greatly. And not just in the rules, in how you played it. I remember we never used a caller. We barely had a party leader. You know, you went around. We had small groups. All right. When I say small groups, we had generally 3 to 6 players and a DM. More in college, but that was different. But generally speaking, we had 3 to 6 players. One summer we had more, but you could control it. You didn't need a caller. I played one session with older players when I was in high school, and it was 13 people around the table. You couldn't address the DM without going through the caller. And since me and my friend both had first level characters in a party that was all 8 to 11 or 8 to 12, we spent the day doing nothing. That evening was spent carrying shit for the party. Because we couldn't participate in combat without dying, and you know what? They weren't going to have us back, and I don't think we were ever going to go back. So it played differently depending at the table you were going to play at. So that consistency that Gary was hoping for was a bit of a fallacy. But tell me how it worked for you. Tell me what your experience was. And how has it changed now? All right? I'd like to hear. I'd like to know. Comment, like, subscribe. You know, the thing. Be safe, be well. God bless. Roll those dice, roll them well. I'll be back again tomorrow with a live stream at 8 p.m. Oh my God. And another live stream with Rach and I Saturday at 8 p.m. Hope to see you both times. Later, folks. Be good.